If we had the opportunity this semester to do a full survey of both Old Testament and New Testament scriptural texts and what they have to say about the drama of human beings and human beings becoming more self-aware of their moral and ethical environment, we would have a very interesting task indeed. And one of the things that we would want to concentrate on would be to trace the different kinds of notions and descriptions of relationship that exist between God and between human beings, and to see how very often in the Old Testament and New Testament scriptures, what is seen as being an ideal kind of relationship between God and human beings, ideal because it's initiated by God or created by God or sustained by God, that those ideal relationships very often find their way into the more complex and the more challenging relationships amongst and between human beings. So there's often an interplay between how human beings understand God's relationship to them and then how they understand the manner by which they are meant to be in relationship faithfully with other human beings. One of the important descriptions of relationship that we do find in the Old Testament, which we will consider a little bit in this unit, is that of covenant. And a covenant from the Old Testament was and remains an understanding of relationship of fidelity. That a covenant is a relationship that is engaged in by two parties, where each party pledges to be faithful and loyal and even, in a sense, flexible based on the requirements made of the covenant at the very beginning. It's a very different kind of understanding of relationship, for example, than contract. Contract, in our contemporary sense of law, is a transactional kind of relationship where two parties get something from each other and they can make or break that contract and that agreement, that relationship, based on certain things. It's easier to get out of a contract if you have grounds for getting out of it. A contract is something to be entered into and then sort of departed from once the terms of the transaction have been completed. A covenant, by contrast, is something very different. And a covenant, in one sense, is basically in existence not because either party is getting anything out of the other, though very often gifts and transactional kinds of realities do exist in the covenant. But at the foundation of it, a covenant exists because of love. Love is the reason for a covenant. And so when in the Old Testament we begin tracing how it is that God begins to make a covenant with human beings, and he makes a covenant with the Jewish people as is described in the Old Testament, we see that what comes up over and over again is that sense of love of God for other people, and love of people that should be showed back to God out of gratitude and out of loyalty for the covenant itself. You'll be doing some reading for this unit that describes a little bit of that Old Testament and New Testament background to the notion of covenant. You're also going to be doing some reading where that notion or that model of relationship of covenant is applied in some ways to the relationship between a physician and a patient, or between a healthcare practitioner and a patient. And this is kind of interesting and important for us to note, because we should realize, and I think we've encountered this in some of the other reading and discussion so far this semester, through the 20th century, the basic idea of what a relationship between a physician, for example, as a healthcare practitioner, and a patient should be shifted from being basically a relationship of beneficence, if you recall that bioethical principle that we discussed earlier in the term. Beneficence, by which a physician is meant to energetically use his or her knowledge and skill and activity to care for the patient out of the goodness and the concern for the goodness of that relationship of care. And in that relationship of beneficence, or seeing beneficence as the motivating factor in the relationship, of course, puts the emphasis on the physician and the physician's activity and the physician's initiating different kinds of things. Well, in the 20th century, that had been the model of the relationship between a physician and the patient. And it moved from that to being more interested in looking at things from the patient's side of the equation, as it were. Looking at things from the perspective of the patient's autonomy. How well the patient is able to make decisions for themselves. How well the patient is able to initiate care or direct care or prevent certain things from happening, or to request certain things, or to even demand that certain things happen for them. So there is very much a shift in the model, or a shift in the understanding of what the relationship between a physician and the patient should be through the 20th century. Again, from the idea of the beneficence of the physician being paramount to the autonomy of the patient being paramount. And this has an interesting kind of setup with this notion of covenant, does it not? That if we begin to see, as Paul Ramsey suggests, the relationship between a physician and a patient being basically an instantiation of a covenant, then we see not only at the foundation of the relationship, not a contract, not a transactional kind of thing. You give me this and I pay you for the service being the basis of the relationship. But we see it as at foundation being a relationship of love of some sort, of care. And yet a relationship where, like in the covenants of the Old Testament, there was a sense of almost equality between the two parties, between God and the human beings. Now, that doesn't mean that the two parties do not possess differences or um, differences in skill, differences in knowledge, differences in power, even. But in a covenant, there tends to be much more of an equal ebb and flow of power and authority, of initiation and response. And so it seems to me, at least, and I want to suggest that this notion of covenant is actually a way of binding together the the benefit of beneficence on the part of a physician or the safeguards of autonomy on the part of the patient, that covenant may in fact be a way of balancing those two values at the same time. I'm curious to know what you think of that after doing the reading and watching the initial videos and making some of the comments, and look forward to the discussion as it continues. Thank you.